So, what is it, 2003? So let's probably get it until 2005 before we really start. So, and well, first of all, thanks a lot for showing up on this Saturday evening, right? So it's, you know, here in Cyprus, the weather is bad, so it's not really much to do. Plus there is, you know, the lockdown from 9 p.m. So there is really nothing to do besides of doing the webinars. So, and I hope that you are in the same position. But anyway, so, you know, thanks for coming and taking your time. So what we are going to discuss today is one of the most, you know, favorite, the ones most frequent questions, the ones which is the one about the hip subluxation, the hip problems, and all these other things related to the hip. And of course, you know, when we start this conversation, we'll obviously move into the kind of related things. So I'll, you know, even since what, 10 years ago, and from time to time, I've been doing this, you know, videos on the hip subluxation matters. But the question always keeps popping up, and in different approaches, I cover different sort of facets of this problem. So it makes sense to kind of get back to it. And also, besides of just watching the video when I'm just yapping from the screen somewhere in the background, so it's probably better to, you know, be able to ask the questions right away. So that's why if you have questions, I guess this format has two different versions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there would be Q&A, and that would be a chat thing. So I guess if you can do both to ask the questions, and I think that we will also have hopefully, you know, the option, there's also the option of raising the hand. So in that respect, that's what we are looking for, and in that sense, I hope that we will be able to do well. Okay, just checking, so I can see the chat. Welcome everyone. Say thanks. Hi Leonid, hi everybody. We can hear you, Mr. Blyum, so that sounds very, very promising. Okay, so we got a good number, like 50 participants, so that's very encouraging. And it's 20:06, so let's actually start. I hope that we can do it. Okay, so the hip. Well, you see, this question, on the one hand, for many years, when it was coming to the question of the hip, it was always kind of bugging me in a way that, you know, guys, if when you face the challenges and when we face so many other issues and so on, well, like why so much focus on the hip, right? And that's really one of the bigger things. And in fact, this focus on the hip has, you know, at least two big reasons. So one big reason is obvious, because the hip is the easiest to be x-rayed. You know, like if you look at the way how the standard orthopedic and physical therapy approach kind of gets the information about the body. So what's happening to the child, right? So the main source of this information is the x-ray, right? Because even the physical assessment has to kind of fit into the x-ray, right? So the x-ray is the first thing, and the physical assessment is secondary. So, and the second thing, which really makes the hip issue problematic, relates to this important thing, that the hips could be painful. And that's really the true challenge, the true largest thing, because the hips, they could be painful. Why is that happening? I mean, I remember that, you know, it was already maybe 8 years ago or something like this. So I was at one of those cerebral palsy conferences, and that's where this was a conversation about the hip surgeries, and it was really clearly stated that the hips are the most painful. the most painful for the surgeries, even compared to the, like, say, spinal surgeries, which could be 10 times as large in terms of the number of cuts and the total like bulk of surgery. And why is it happening? It's happening for the simple reason that for the hip being such a mobile thing, which has this so-called ball and socket type of movement, so the relative percentage and the relative proportion between the receptors which are responsible for position and the receptors which are giving the pain, so this proportion is shifted in favor of the pain receptors. So let's kind of put it into a relatively simple format. So you see, like, let's ask a simple question. For example, we often see hand deformations, feet deformations. And these hand and feet deformations, they could be really significant, right? Like really significant, very twisted hand and so on. But what happens? The child doesn't really complain because, this element is not so much on the map of the body in terms of their pain receptors. So within the hand, there would be more of their proprioceptors, right? So you see the receptors which are, indicating the position rather than the pain. And that's why, sometimes it might be painful to look at the hand, right? So you see when you're observing it, but, it doesn't really hurt. So the same thing with the foot. Before the foot starts hurting, it takes, like a lot of effort and a lot of this kind of forced standing and forced walking and all these other things. So the natural question, why? Right? And the answer to this question is the proportion. So I'll give you just sort of arbitrary numbers, right? So you see, let's say if we take the example of the foot, say 90% of the information would be coming from the positional receptors, and then the last 10 would be coming from the pain receptors. And if you take the hip, that would be, say, 50-50, or say 60% of information coming from the pain receptor or from the proprioceptors, and only 40%, and then 40% coming from the pain receptors. So why is this relation so important? Because the two, the positional receptors and the pain receptors, they share the same gate at the head. So the simplest example, if I were to, accidentally, hurt my finger, right? Suppose I took a hammer and decided to do some, handiwork or something like this, or get squashed with the door and so on. What would be the first thing? The first thing would be to rub it, and that would be the shaking action. And at first, it kind of doesn't make much sense, like how would the shaking change the pain perception and whether it helps at all. The research shows it does help. Why? Because the information that comes from the positional receptors, which you activate when you shake your hand, is traveling twice as fast, and it's then the information that comes from the pain receptors. So you can imagine the situation. For example, you've got some, boss at the top floor, at the 10th floor, and then, two signals are entering the building. So one is walking the staircase, that's the pain receptor, and the other one is taking the elevator. That would be the one that is the proprioceptive one. So, of course, the proprioceptive one, boom, arrives to the boss first and says, well, let's kind of narrow the door, narrow the gate for the pain receptor. So by the time the pain arrives, the opening for it is already smaller. That's why this kind of instinctive type of the reflex of shaking your hand or rubbing your hand and so on is so important, right? Because that is really showing you the relationship between the proprioceptors and the pain receptors. So, and once we understood that those two are linked to each other, right? So you see, that gives us a very, very clear understanding of what one shall do with pains, or how shall one prevent pains. So if the positional information, if the total like representation of the certain joint, hip joint, elbow joint, shoulder joint, and so on, is sitting or like is comfortably done by the positional receptors, then the pain receptors are quiet. So there is no point switching on the pain receptors. So they are not needed because they are basically showing this kind of the last round of defense, showing that the movement itself is going somewhere in the wrong direction. So that's really the thing. So in that respect, we clearly see two strategies, right? So you see, if we see that for one reason or another, the pain receptors, for example, in the hip are firing and there is a discomfort, so there are two strategies, right? So one strategy would be the standard medical strategy. So suppress the signals that come from the pain receptors by, the painkillers and all the other things. But this approach doesn't really change the situation long term. So because, if it's, if you're doing the suppression and the situation is not really changing in favor of the positional receptors, then you are actually not gaining anything. And then later on, you would be facing even greater trouble. So that's really the big thing. So what we want to shift the balance in such a way that we would be addressing the positional receptors. So if it's like a simple equation, right? So you see you've got positional receptors, you've got the pain receptors. If the pain receptors are overly activated, what does it mean? There is a deficit of presence, the deficit of information, the deficit of activation for the positional receptors. So it's very simple. So what we shall do, we shall address the positional receptors. And in that sense, what we know and what we have for sure in ABR is that when it comes to the positional discomforts or the hip discomforts and so on, well, we are, I would say, 95% reliable in terms of handling the hip pains. So even in children who are big, even in children who are depleted in size, even in the children with a lot of other issues, we are very reliable in that based on this very simple logic, right? So if there is a discomfort, we actually like raise the game and bring the additional intensity in terms of stimulating the entire area around the hip joint and, helping to switch the balance back into the main representation that comes from the positional receptors. So that's a very, very simple logic. And in that sense, it comes into the same package, right? So how ABR in general works, right? So that we are looking for the maximum distribution of loads and efforts, right? So you see basically what is the whole entire essence of ABR. So the child with cerebral palsy ends up in the situation when the loads are too concentrated, when there are too few muscles, too few muscle fibers, muscle bundles, and so on, which are able to participate in positions and movements. And because of this, those elements are being overloaded. So the brain has the only option of recruiting and using those elements. So what is our strategy? Our strategy is always the same. We want to bring greater diversity, right? So you see, we want to spread the loads in such a way that they will be, instead of just a few intense workings along the very narrow path, we would be able to spread it into the multiple ways into much sort of, and from the large, long, superficial muscles go into all sorts of this shorter, smaller, distributed, spreading the things around. So basically, that's what ABR is about, right? So how to take the super concentrated loads, which the child cannot really handle, and then, basically start stimulating the things around and creating the, getting the distributed loads. So that's really as simple as that. But that moves us from the first discussion about handling the discomforts, that moves us to the next question about the positional aspects. And this is where I will start screen sharing so that we will add some clarification to this. Tech, screen sharing. Ping. Hmm. Just okay, так. Okay. I hope that the visibility is all right. So I will start here, and that's a nice feature of the Zoom thing, that I'm able to enthusiastically do the drawings here. Let's test it. Yes, we can do the drawings just fine. Okay, so let's start with the standard set of questions. So what we have, right? We have these typical questions that come all the time. Well, we are about to visit, or we have visited the orthopedic surgeon, and they are telling us that the hip is doing worse, that it's getting bad, and then the situation is really dramatic, and then, well, soon the surgery will be needed. That's one version, right? In some countries, the position is more aggressive, and they say, oh, let's do it now and prevent it with the surgery. So, and this is how we get children who had received hip surgeries at the age of 4, at the age of 5, and sometimes even at the age of 2. So this is really one of those things which really, unfortunately, has been happening a lot in the recent years. The fact that the whole thing became much more of a kind of earlier period, and this idea that you can somehow correct and prevent things with the hip surgery, unfortunately, this idea has been enforced in many countries. Because you see, historically, it hasn't been like this. Say, when I started in the 90s, so, and even in the very beginning of zeros, there were still enough of the old school orthopedic surgeons. And the orthopedic surgeons from that old school, they were more, I would say, honest and more humble, I would say, in first place. They were more humble, and they kind of didn't have anything to prove. So they really faced the reality and said, you know what, if it's a growing body, we can't really predict of what's going to happen. So we can't really predict how we reposition the joints and the bones and so on, and it's unknown. So the strategy has always been very, very simple. So we wait until the growth is completed. And once the growth is completed at the age of 18, 20, then we do the surgery just to kind of put everything together and make it more sort of usable. It's only in case of the sort of some early pains or some really major discomforts, the surgeon would actually try to interfere. Unfortunately, shall I say thanks or due to the big drive that came from Australia and Sweden in the beginning of the zeros. So, and by the 2010s, the situation has really become much worse, right? So you see the new school of aggressive orthopedic surgeons appeared who believed that instead of having that doing one surgery at the age of 18, that was kind of very weak, passive, not being, compassionate enough. So their strategy was to switch to, say, 3 surgeries, right? So to do surgeries about the age of whatever, 5, 7, or maybe even earlier, then to do another surgery at around the age of 12, right? So when the child is at the growth spurt, and then, one more surgery, still yet one more surgery at the age of 18 or something like this. So this is the world that we are dealing with now, unfortunately. So, but then, oops, what are you doing? Barbara. So then that's the thing that we are dealing with. So what I'm going to explain today and what I want to bring in is to get this bigger picture. The bigger picture is that we have to take their balanced perspective on the entire hip thing. That the question of subluxation, right? So you see, we're going to look at how the actual thing is formed, what is happening there, and look at this clear. Am I missing something? Okay. So to make the things clear, first point that I'm going to address now is that what you see typically with X-rays is the conversation that moves into this domain of measurements. And if it's the domain of measurements, right, so you see it looks like something like this. So people come up, take all the measurements, give you all sorts of their information, and you can see it all fancy looking and looks very scientific. And well, let's remind ourselves what are the things which are being measured here. So this is very simple. First points that you have to remember, right? So you say, oops, no, that's something here. Let's do that. Okay, so you see here, you've got the roof, you've got the roof, you've got the head, and to a certain extent, another thing that you're also looking at would be the actual angle of the femur's neck. So that's what typically is being looked at. So you see, if I get you back to the, if I get you back to this healthy X-ray, healthy X-ray, healthy X-ray. No, healthy X-ray is healthy X-ray is here. So if we get back to the healthy X-ray, right? So you see, what do we see here? We see these basics. We see these basics. So this is the roof, and this roof has a center. Then if you draw the line from a corresponding line through the arc of the femur head, see the two match each other, right? So you see that, what does it mean? In simple terms, that means that there is a 0% deviation, right? So you see there is no deviation there. So if we look at the case where the hip is very shifted, like for example this one, then this version, you see, we draw this line here, we draw this line here, they don't cross each other at all, so that will be not the subluxation but the dislocation. And then we look at this one, right? So you see here you've got some partial cover. So if this is the top, right? So you see, then this is the top of the acetabulum, this is the top of the bone. So they don't match each other, but then there is a partial coverage between the two things, right? So you see, that would be still, you know, kind of going around the subluxation, but technically speaking, if it's more than 2/3, then it's considered to be a dislocation. So that's the conversation that always kind of comes up, and the whole thing moves immediately towards the discussion based on the X-rays. So my point is always the same. If we get back to the healthy X-ray, so what we have to do, we have to look at the bigger picture. Bigger picture is we have to move away from just these areas, right? And then start looking at the bigger picture all around. So you see, take the entire thing into the account. So that means that we want to look what's happening with the iliacs. We want to see what's happening with the ischial part. We want to see what's happening with the trochanthers. So we want to see the entire surrounding thing. So that's a very simple thing, because the X-ray is just a reflection of the things which are happening in the real life. So once we look at this, we'll understand some basic points. So this is there. Well, I'll start with the complicated part, and hopefully that works. Okay, so you see, if we look at this, right, so you see that is their total pelvic bone. But there is always a but. So this pelvic bone itself is not elementary. This pelvic bone consists of the elements. And there are 3 main parts. So if we look here, that's the main parts. Okay, let me see which I should start with. So what is the simplest? Yeah, that's the simplest. Right, so you see, this is the simplest one, so which tells you that it has 3 main parts. So this is the upper part, the ilium, right? So you see, then you've got the pubic part, and this is the bottom part, the ischium. So, or the ischium, depending on how you see it, right? So you see, that's the, here you've got the upper part, the ilium, then you've got the ischium and the pubic part here. So that's what we're looking at. Now, when we got a closer look at this thing, we understand that what is important here, it has 3 parts, right? And those 3 parts, they merge with each other at this place, which is called the triradiate cartilage, right? So you see, the name speaks for itself. Tri is for the 3, radiate means that it comes from the radius to the center, right? So you see, that's really the thing. And now comes the very important next picture. Very important next picture. Let me find it. This. You see, or maybe we can start even with this, right? So you see, that's the same as I've just shown you, but with some more comments. So these are the lateral and medial views, right? So you see, we're more interested in the lateral one, so the one that looks from where the hip is inserted. So what do you read here? It's a special highlight. Special highlight. Where is the special highlight? Here. Oops. Draw. Yeah, special highlight. Note the continuity between the acetabular cartilage and the triradiate cartilage. So why is it so important, right? So you see AC, acetabular cartilage. So that is their acetabulum. That's their actual cover, right? So you see that's the cartilage that covers the roof. So you see that's the actual cartilage that makes the roof, right? And there is a continuity between them. Now the next picture is going to show us this even better, even better. So that will be this. So it's more technical, but you can see how it all works. See here, you've got this demonstration. You've got this demonstration, so which says os, which is stands for the bone, right? So you see this is the acetabulum. So this is the bony part of the roof. This is the cartilage. This is epiphysis. This is where it grows. And you see here you've got the acetabular epiphysis. So you see basically that's how the whole thing grows. It sort of covers, right? It grows and covers their bone. But where does it go to? It will go further down. So that's the critical thing for us to understand, that this big pelvis thing, and the insertion of the roof, they are intimately connected. You cannot separate them in the in the process of growth. So in fact, it's quite the opposite. You see, here is a detailed version of what I was talking about. So you see here, you've got, besides of those three lines, you've got this additional points, right? So these points, the red color points, and you've got this whatever purple color points, or whichever the name. So, and you see here are the names: primary ossification center, secondary ossification center. So this is ossification. That's a process of formation of the bone. So your child, right? So you see in the beginning, well, as the child, the newborn has cartilage, that has very little of the bone itself, right? So you see, if we look at the situation, for example here, and look at the x-ray of the, this is the 1 year old, you see that all these parts, they are far from each other and they haven't closed their shapes. They're sort of this floating in space. And then that is there, and they are flatter. And then what has to happen? So you see, this thing has to kind of turn. There has to be this twist within the bone that will actually be critical for the formation of the head angle. So that's really what we are facing. So if you have to understand that the twist of this part, and you can also see here that when the upper part, when the iliac bone is not properly shaped and rotated, when it's still in the cartilage state, you see that the head femur is not, the angle of the neck, the neck of the femur is not properly angled. It's still very vertical. So that is a critical thing for us. So you see, this is what we want to see, and that we want to pay attention to here, this link. And that's really the essential thing, because once we move on back to this, right, so you see, we understand that the most important things for the child's development of the pelvis, of the leg, is this proper formation of the pelvis, so that we want to get as much as possible from these elements, because it's the way how these three bones connect. And finally, you see, like, you can think of them as this twist, right? So you see, if I take two large handles and I take a piece of paper or a mask, right? So you see here, if I start with it being flat and then I apply the turn, right? So you see, then this is where greatest loads are going to be allocated. So the key point for us in understanding the X-ray has to be the quality of these parts. So what's going on here? How, you see, if we look at the evolution of the healthy X-ray, so it starts like this, then goes like this, that would be the 3-year, the 2-year, no, that's the 9 months old. Sorry, I mixed them. So you see, that's a 9 months old, that's much less. That's 11-month old, that's more. And that's the 5-year-old, right? So you see here, that's what we want to look at. And that's what I'm actually inviting you to look at the X-rays. So you see, the most important things here are what's happening with those angles, how they're changing, how those links are working, what kind of turn you have with those bones. Because as these parts turn, they are the ones which have a pull at the insertion of the bone, because as we have seen in the other part over here, as we have seen in this part, yes, so that's the connection. And if I move further, yes, so you see that's this connection between the acetabular cartilage and the triradiate cartilage, and this is this thing. Now, let me show you a more familiar image. A more familiar image of the hip is going to look like this, right? So you see, then, that's the one which shows you the ligaments which are surrounding it, and it shows you this part, right? So you see, this is where we are looking, what we are looking at, this part, this connection. So the whole link builds up this way. And we understood that what drives it is the development of the bone, development of the pelvis. Now, this is good news, and that's important news, but then we have to look at the reality. And the reality is this. Let me find the reality part. The reality is this, is that when we look at that picture, we want to understand how the proportions change in humans. So this is the in utero, the fetus, and so on. This is the child at birth. And if we look at it, right, so you see what we understand this thing, so that the head and the pelvis. So effectively what happens, oops, let me draw this line, right? So you see what happens if we look at the way how the healthy person develops. So this part, the relative size of the pelvis of the healthy person compared to the relative size of the newborn, it's again, we're not talking about absolute, proportionally, it's 5 times greater, right? So it's 500% or 5x. So in order to integrate the legs, the pelvis has to massively change. And that's really the main obstacle that we are facing. We have to acknowledge this and, acknowledge this reality, because when we look at this, right, so you see what's happening. That's the explanation. That's where you can see how the pelvis grows. So the pelvis grows via this change. So in that respect, if you look at the way what's happening, the healthy person, as they breathe, the healthy child, their breathing raises the intra-abdominal pressure, and this intra-abdominal pressure translates into 20,000 times a day the impact that forms all these areas, right? So you see, and that's why when we talk about this area, this is the area, if we count the pelvis from this level, right? So you see, this is that huge pelvis of the huge pelvis of the grown-up. And that's what we really want to develop. But without this downwards pressure, we cannot. You might ask, And what happened to this downwards pressure? My child is breathing, but, well, the answer is very simple. So this is also a pretty good picture. I like it very much because it shows us some important things. You see here, you can see the diaphragm. So look, in order to breathe, what do you need? You need to create the drag within your thoracic capacity, right? So you see that means that the diaphragm has to go down one way or another, but the diaphragm has to go down. Now, if your ribs are not very well connected, if you are weak and so on and so forth, so what's going to happen? Instead of forcing the diaphragm down, what happens to a child? In their case, it's this scenario. So the other version to get the diaphragm down is just to pull by the sides. You see, if I take this and all this whatever mask, right, and you see if it's like bent like this, if I pull it from the sides, it will go down. So that is enough to create their breathing space at the top. But for some children, even that is not enough. So you see, they need to use the abdominal push outwards to create additional vacuum effect of suction of the diaphragm down in order to force the upper part, in order to force this air in. But what happens if you are creating this negative pressure within the abdominal cavity? Then, unfortunately, instead of developing the pelvic expansion, you end up with the pelvic collapse. So you see, basically the pelvis goes into this suction mode instead of getting into the expansion mode. So that's really the main challenge that we are facing. And you see, guys, I mean, I have to be honest with you, right? So you see, in that sense, this challenge, this magnitude of the pelvic deficit, when we talk about the children who are level 3, 4, 5, this deficit of the pelvis development could be absolutely massive, you know. So to compensate for this 5, 6, 7, 10 times deficit, we just often we don't have enough hands, or we don't have enough time, we don't have enough, power to deal, because when the healthy body, it's a 24/7 365, and there is no way that you can work 24/7 365 and kind of get all these things. So you see, we have the constraints. We have to face the reality. What are our realities? So you see, like, if we get 10 hours a week from a family, that's good. So that means that we have to build within 500 hours a year, we have to build something which is going to be as, or at least create a positive tendency, right? So you see, because whilst the total year, right, is that it's 168 hours a week, not 10 hours a week, right? So you see, that's why the year is roughly saying is 9,000 hours, right? Or 10,000 hours to round it up. So we have 5% of the year to make the impact which is going to compensate the troubles created by 10,000 hours. So this is the fundamental challenge, and that's what we have to be realistic. That's why we have to prioritize, and we have other things besides of the hips and so on. So, and in that sense, if I look at the question here, which asks about the, about the X-rays and about the, somewhere here, yes, has hip subluxed for years, and with growth has gotten worse, entire body till significant wrapping. Okay, but that is, well, you see here we got another part, right? So you see we got another part. So we are dealing with a person, not a machine, right? So you see, in that sense, Well, yeah, thank you, Joe. That's a good point. So that's that's the thing that we have to face, right? So you see, we have to face these objective limitations that we are dealing with, right? So you see, we have to accept the fact that we are not whatever gods, not demigods. We are just people, and you are humans, I am human, and in that sense we have just that. That's one of the reasons to compensate for the hours that has been the introduction of the ABR machine and so on. But then it's in itself, it also has things. So you see, we're dealing with the fact because the child could be also sensitive, and how sensitive and so on. So we try to balance things as much as possible. But that is the essence that of what that we're facing, of the trouble. So what we are trying to do, right? So you see, we're trying to maximize the contribution for this pelvic development. That's what we are trying to do. So that's why the pelvic impact is so important, because it sets this primary thing. But then the other question that we have is that besides of the conversation of the pelvis, we have to return to the hip itself. And my point is very, very simple. So it's very important to not to fall into this trap of the X-ray. So the X-ray itself doesn't really show you the true transition. Because when we look at those pictures, at these pictures, and when we look at that explanation that we have just understood here about the development of the pelvis, so what we realize, right, is that as a parent, your best bet, your best focus, your best priority is to develop and maximize the benefit for the pelvis. It's this transition at this triradiate cartilage and so on, which is actually like improving the connection and building the whole thing. But, but, what does it mean? That also means that you have to expect that the leg itself would be changing the position. And that's the trouble with the X-ray as the source of the information. For example, this recent review that I have done, I'm going to show you this part here. Yeah, you see, these are two X-rays. See, that's the X-ray before, and that's the X-ray later. So what I first get from the family, it was very recent, it's like, oh, you know what? This is the X-ray from the last year, right? So you see the X-ray from 2019, and this is the X-ray from the 2020. And what they're being told, look, things are getting bad, you are in trouble, because if we look at the hip, here there is a partial coverage, and here is a partial coverage, but now there is no coverage at all. And here, well, it's more or less the same, but on the left side there is no coverage. So the statement is everything is bad, right? So you see things are getting worse. But at the same time, it's a great X-ray, because it tells us that we are able, it tells us that gives us the opportunity to look at the other things. Now look here, look at the top, look at the parts that we've just discussed. So what you are seeing here, you are seeing that the two parts of the pelvis, they're dramatically different. So the left side, you have this huge gap. On the right side, you can hardly find anything. So you see the projection of this side and the projection of that side, they are dramatically different. Why is that? It's not that her pelvis is so different. It means that it's completely twisted. it's tilted, shifted to the side. So connections of the iliac bone, of this, the triple bone connection of the two halves of the pelvis to the sacrum is very poor. Look at this area, right? So you see here again, look at this curve and this curve. So the entire opening of the pelvic floor is also distorted. And now if we look further, look at these connections of this, the cartilage, the tricartilage area. So look, this is kind of smashed onto each other. Here is the big gap. Look at the position. So you see, if the top part is twisted on the right, the bottom part is twisted on the left. So it's this diagonal deformation of the entire pelvis. So, and now we look at the new X-ray. What we are seeing? We're seeing that the two sides are way more balanced at the top. They are way more balanced at the bottom. You can see that this connection itself is shaping up. The roof, which has been flat, is now starting to shape some kind of coverage there. So if anything, when we, and also you see the pelvic floor here is much more balanced. So if we look at the two X-rays, we see that the pelvic thing is changing, the two iliacs are changing, the two ischias are changing, the iliacs are changing, the connections at the tricartilage is changing. So that's a complete transformation of the pelvis. But the leg is dependent, the leg is inserted into the pelvis. So when I look at this pelvis from the physical development perspective and say, hey, that's a great transformation. That's a great transformation of the pelvis. So finally, this is a relatively young child who is like 3-4 years old. So for her, it's a great transformation. We have managed to gain a significant improvement of the total pelvis. So this part is easier to handle. Again, to insert the leg, you need the full size, right? You see, you have to keep in mind it's a 500% deficit. But the fact is that this is really the part where you are building the key components. And it's understandable that we are dealing with the race against time. We are dealing with the race against, like a lot of other factors. But what can we do? We are in the very realistic, we have to be realistic there. But the key message that is still given to you, right? Especially if the child is in relatively severe condition. So the key message is about if this is what happens, then, with this hip subluxation, things are going to be bad. So this is where I want to make my main statement so that you would really understand it very well. So that it's essential to understand that this development of the pelvis, where is that? Yeah. So that this development of the pelvis, what you have here, it only looks like a roof, but it's not a roof, right? So you see, this is my central point. It's not a roof, it's a lip. So, and that's really the key thing. So when you look at the x-rays and you get worried, right? Why? Because you think that, that's a kind of a free floating leg, which is just kind of jumping out and it's not integrated. This is not true. In fact, what you are facing there, you are facing the integration. That's why we're looking at these pictures here. So that's the true manifestation. This is the true way how the leg looks like. So you see, it's multiple layers of the connections. It's the hip joint capsule, and it's a multiple ligaments which are being on top of it. And why is it so important for us to understand this? Because now, as we look back to this original more complicated picture here. You see this. So how does that look like to you? It looks like a lip. It's a lip that covers the thing, and it's even called the labrum, the lip, at the end of the day. So that's really the key point. And why is that so important? Because depending on how we understand the situation, whether it's a roof or the lip, it completely changes the way that we look at the development and the way that we look at the stimulation of this thing. So that's really the key. Because if you think that you are dealing with the roof, so what would you do? You would do what everybody does. You know, what every single orthopedic surgeon on the planet is telling you. Put them, or and the physical therapist, right? So you see, put them into the standing frames. Why you should put them into the standing frames? Because then this is what creates the load. That's the weight of the pelvis that presses onto the stationary legs, and that kind of squeezes in and makes this. I mean, it's this statement hasn't changed for like the last 150 years. And once you realize it's really like dramatically bad, you know, like believing that you actually push, the bone pushes into it, it's really, you know, like doesn't really match what we've just seen in, you know, in that sense. But it's this super simple perspective. But if we understand that this is a lip, then we understand that this is going to work in all positions. You see, what you want to maximize the activity around this entire area, because it's the rotation and the moves which are going to stimulate this connection. And it's going to work 24/7. It's going to work when the child is sitting, when the child is lying, when the child is doing whatever. And in fact, the standing, the fake standing position would be the last thing. It would be the one where it's the least likely to work. You know, in one of the home videos, I have received one of these brilliant pictures. You know, I want to show you, you know, like, you know, the child's identity will remain anonymous because she is from the back, but this is a child who is in a better condition. And look at this. See, look at this triangle, right? So you see, this is a child who is in a better state. She can stand herself. So this is like a child who is between level 2 and 1. But look at this triangulation. So that is this triangulation. That's the best way that the child can stand. And even if you try to bring the legs close and so on, it doesn't change anything because, you know, why she's doing like this? Because, of course, she is using this, she is using these connections. She is using that connection from the inside of the leg to her pelvis. So you've heard me talking about this, that this is this infamous iliopsoas connection, but I want you to really visualize this triangle. It's so obvious. See, such an obvious triangle. Let me zoom in, right? And let me draw it once again so it will become very clear. See, she is utilizing this triangle. That's what she's doing. And when she's moving, you see, she keeps the triangle. And you might say, well, Mr. Blyum, that's a strong statement. How would you prove it? Say, well, it's easy. Easy. Now, let's look at the X-rays, which are more typical X-rays for the children that we are dealing with. So now, this is actually even coming from, you know, somewhere from the internet. It's not from the ABR families. So look at this. What's happening on those X-rays? So what's happening, you know, let's disregard all the other things. But if we would look at this, so what we're going to see the difference at those points. You see, these points are growing, whilst these points are not growing. And if you look at the healthy child, what you would see exactly the opposite picture. See here, it wasn't much on the outside, but something on the inside, right? And now look at this one. So this healthy child by the age of 5 has already big things here on the sides and almost nothing on the inside. Why is that? Because the healthy child uses their connection through the sides of the pelvis, the sides of the leg, and so on. So that's where this whole connection goes, and that becomes this connection in the trochanter. And what happens to the child with the CP? The child with the CP is then, unfortunately, and to a great extent, by literally shooting yourself in the foot, by forcing children into the standing frames, this is what we get. So that will be a typical X-ray. So from the child at the age of say 10 or 12, so that who is at the level 4 or 5. So what do you see here? Once again, unfortunately, you are seeing this massive lesser trochanters, right? And these are the names, and you will find them in the other videos from me. So this is the lesser trochanter, but it's big. And this is a greater trochanter, and this greater trochanter is very small. So my point is that when you look at this kid, again, the child in a better condition here, when you look at her, of course, she is using the triangle. And if we look back, what's behind this triangle? What's behind? What's the mechanics of it? So the mechanics of it is this. This is the infamous iliopsoas. So that this is the triangle that the body uses, that the brain recruits to stabilize the leg in respect to the lumbar. Why? Because this is the only available shortcut when the pelvis is not developed, right? And then what is the next part here? That would be the adductors. And if you try to stretch the adductors, if you try to do, what are you stimulating? Well, you are then stimulating these areas, right? You are stimulating those connections which are already dominant. And watch this, right? So you see, if you look at the orientation of the iliopsoas, how it goes into this diagonal. And if it goes into this diagonal, there is no wonder the child is arching, the child is sliding, the child cannot, like sit, or the child, when you put them into the wheelchair or the stroller and so on, they arch. So, and this is a critical point, because what you have to ask yourself here is this. Well, but in this situation, where is the actual hip? And the next thing is that where is the actual pelvis? Because the iliopsoas bypasses, it doesn't stimulate the actual hip. So that's the point. Like if you look at the way how the thing works, standing frame doesn't do anything good because it stimulates this link, but it doesn't stimulate the actual connection at the hip. And if we look closer at the pictures here, what we are going to see, look at that. So this is a zoomed in view of the same thing. See here, you can see that the hip joint itself and all these ligaments on, so they are under, right? So you see they are under the iliopsoas. So iliopsoas bypasses them, and the more you are training this iliopsoas by forcing the child to stand or by doing the stretching, the greater conflict you are bringing between the iliopsoas and the hip. So the paradox is that the more you do the standing frame, the more you try to do anything in this area in a forced way, the more you cause the conflict where the iliopsoas start irritating and start blocking the hip and start creating the painful effects there. So that's the unfortunate reality. So, all of that I'm showing here, I'm showing you just the basic X-rays. and showing the basic x-rays and the basic anatomy. But the whole thing here is to really change the perspective, that what you want to, that you have to realize that we are dealing with the hip joint, and that it's a tensional thing. It's a tensional thing. It's tension, not compression, that stimulates. So, and that's why what we really want, we want to get the maximum stimulus into their capsular part, right? So you see, we want to get the maximum stimulus into their total pelvic development. Where is that? Okay, so you see, like, and we want to get as many contributions to the pelvic or to the pelvic opening itself, and we want to get the contributions to the development of the iliacs, right? But where the development of the iliacs come from? Very much from this. So you see, and that's why in the recent, like in the recent year, when we really kind of stepped up the game in terms of the vibration tools, so that gave us the new access, absolutely, much greater access into these hidden areas. That's what makes me so happy, because before, even when because here we can work with whatever, with the squeezes and all the other techniques, like we can work better at the hip, and then we can manage, for example, things related to the, if there are discomforts and so on, we can work at the hip joint itself. But those areas, they were very hidden, so it was very difficult to get there when it's all fused and so on. We couldn't really get so much. So that's why what I see in the rust here has been absolutely exciting. So we really get much better developments of the pelvis, much better responses and so on. So that's very, very exciting. And in that sense, that is the link that I want you to keep in mind, right? I want you to keep in mind this link that we've just discussed. So that the link goes through this way, right? So you see that the link goes through, it goes through the connection, so which we've shown earlier, right? So you see this connection that we discussed at the previous section. So when we were here, right, so you see this formation of the cartilage and this link between the between the actual iliac part and the hip joint itself. So that's my main point. On the one hand, we are in the position where we have to be humble enough and recognize our limitations. The respiratory pump and so on is not working for us at the 100% capacity. So we are always dealing with the deficit of time. We're always dealing with this kind of challenges. But at the same time, we want to be smart. And being smart means that we have to get the right understanding what's happening at the hip joint itself, the capsular connection, the ligament connection, and so on. And the second thing that we need to understand is that it's actually directly our priority is to see changes within the pelvis itself. So that's really what I want to highlight. Okay, so Greg and Vicky said, okay, so let me. So I guess what we want to do right now, so it's been 1 hour and 5 minutes that I've been talking non-stop, and I guess we can probably wrap it up in that sense and move to their questions and answers before people